To begin the story, we have to go back some years when we sat to discuss what was the perfect classroom going to look like, what was the ideal situation for a teacher going to appear like. This was an interesting conversation because it took us into the very basics of what it's like to be a teacher in a classroom in a school. And the heart of where we got to with that conversation was that, for a start, teachers are very different. Teachers can be noisy, they can be quiet, they can be charismatic, they can be shy. But all of those types of teachers can be highly successful. And so what we started with was the idea that teachers could legitimately be very different, but at the same time, they probably had some very common elements that they wanted in the classroom that they wanted to teach in. So we sat down to think, what does a teacher want in a classroom? And that conversation included some very common features. We believed they needed good infrastructure that allowed them to get a good access to the internet. They needed a good presentation tool. They needed a computer that was stable, able to connect up quickly, easily to a presentation tool. So we needed projectors. We needed good visibility, we needed good sound. Jeff, can you think of anything else that...
That just about covers it, and we wanted to have something that gave flexibility. So I've been lucky enough to be in a teaching fellowship in the early 2000s at Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts. And they were one of the first schools in the US to completely digitise and put all the curriculum online. And I saw in the early 2000s students sitting in their rooms with access to all the school materials whenever they wanted it. And that really appealed to me. So we put in the same system, which is the Blackboard Learning Management System, and we allowed staff the flexibility to put whatever resources they need for whatever class into that system, to have good resources in the room in terms of projection, sound, access to the internet, so they could use those materials to teach and enhance their classroom. But more than that, the students had access to all of those resources outside of the classroom. And that was the beginning of our blended learning venture.
That was an interesting conversation because right at the very start, we had within the school, before both of us arrived here, a learning management system that had been homegrown. The problem we faced with that homegrown system was that it was essentially impossible to look into the future and see how is it going to develop and grow, how is it going to mature as a learning management system. So we set up some base principles, and amongst those principles were the ideas that we wanted a learning management system that was robust, strong, world-class, and where the research and development that the company put into that system was going to be of a high quality that would ensure that in a decade's time we would be still operating with an outstandingly good learning management system, but was one that was different to the one we started with today, because we assumed that there was going to be growth and change and development to that system. So that's another reason we went to the system that's used by the large American universities and Australian universities, because we thought this was a company, this was a system that was going to have good research and development as part of its natural development, and we wanted to go with that development.
And as a segue into our iPad program and what happened in the future, we've got some interesting things to talk about in terms of student access to the online learning resources, and we'll cover that in a moment.
What we found in the early days was that teachers just needed to learn how to organise their material. They needed to simply learn the basic mechanics of presenting their courses online. That took a bit of time. People tried different things, and some of them were more successful than others. For example, we discovered that it was better for teachers in a whole year group to put a combined material up rather than to put it up as part of their own individual class, because when material was put up as part of an individual class, it tended to block or lock people out, not because there was a rule, but because people didn't assume they had a right to go and look in another class's work. Whereas when work was placed up as a whole year group, all of a sudden people would look over the shoulders of other very high performing staff.
The collegiate aspect to the learning management system was one of its great successes. And as Peter was alluding to, the old view was to have your classes structured as maths A, B, C, D, and you only ever went into that particular maths class, or Mr. Smith and Mrs. Jones, and you only ever went into Mr. Smith's class, or you only ever went into Mr. Jones' class. Rather than having everything segmented, we just created Year 7 Maths or Year 8 English. And every single resource from every single teacher was pooled into these places. And what it did was it just opened up the amount of access to these resources from our students.
What teachers chose to put on this side varied considerably, both between teachers and between departments. But essentially, as people looked over the shoulder of each other, they learnt more and more about how to prepare their material for online learning. Also, the students drove a lot of the material that we ended up putting on there. They had ideas about what they wanted. They requested teachers to put material onto the learning management system, and very rapidly it started to mature as quite a sophisticated location for the placement of curriculum material.